Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to the third part of the first Heretic. We're on Chapter 6, out of 29. This might just be the record for longest Horus Heresy lore breakdown. It's entirely possible. And we start with Cyrene. So, apparently, she's been wandering the ruins of Monarchia for a couple of months. And surviving. Impressive, okay. Especially since the ruins were apparently frequented by bandits and other miscreants, but, right. We also get a quick mention about Servitors here, so the wordbearers left behind the secret to constructing Servitors, and of course the local population being a religious one, he immediately moved to implement servitude, or penance, for heretics or other quote-unquote sinners. Because of course. I wonder if Lorgar would be pleased to see how much the modern-day Imperium resembles his own ideals. Probably not, honestly. Another interesting thing is, they have been moving towards a planet they are supposed to conquer. The wordbearers, that is. But they have not yet been given the word to actually begin the conquest, because Lorgar has sequestered himself in private, undoubtedly working on the new word. And Cyrene brings up a very interesting question. Argaltal mentions that their word, the wordbearer's word for Lorgar, or, that's not really it, their term of endearment / kinship, as Argaltal himself puts it, is Aurelian, golden, or the golden one. Okay. Cyrene then says, it is strange to have a nickname for a god. And Argaltal then has to explain that Lorgar isn't actually a god. Though, think about it. Lorgar's definition of a god is simply a being of sufficient power. So, why is a Primarch not a god to a mortal human? I mean, even in his own definition, he who sends starships across the universe, he who settles worlds, etc., all of that could also count just as well for Lorgar, and yet Argaltal he explains this to Cyrene as if, no, he's not actually God, he might be a demigod, it's really obvious, really. As if this is, again, just clear. But hey, at this point with the wordbearers, I think we've all gotten very, very used to the doublethink at this point. Oh yeah, no, the Emperor is a god because he has this power. What? Lorgar too has very similar power? No. He's maybe a demigod or something. We haven't really thought about that yet, but we'll get to it, I'm sure. I do like Cyrene, though, because she's a prying little bitch, Argaltal goes, oh no, Lorgar isn't actually hiding from us, that's not why he sequestered itself. The God Emperor's judgment just weighs heavily upon him. He is saddened like the rest of us. And the sheer brass balls on this woman. I mean, she's blind, so maybe she doesn't understand that she's talking to a ginormous humanoid killing machine. But she then goes, you don't sound sad, you sound angry. Which makes Argaltal exceedingly uncomfortable. And unsurprisingly so, we've already talked about how Argaltal was apparently willing to kill a brother, an Ultramarine, because of this humiliation, which already sets the wordbearers a bit apart, but additionally, their worship is incredibly shallow, is it not? The Emperor comes to them and makes them kneel, and that is enough to make them be angry with them, to wish violence upon their brothers. There's a whole song and dance made about how faithful the wordbearers were, but I'm starting to wonder if they truly were all that faithful. Because if they truly were proper religious fanatics and they were censored by their god, would their first reaction truly be to reject and be angry with that god? I don't know, I'm not a religious fanatic, and as far as I know, a literal god has never descended from the sky and repudiated his followers, so I guess it's a bit difficult to say, isn't it? But it clearly, really, really bothers the wordbearers. In this case, Argaltal basically says, I must go now, Mother is calling. To which Cyrene once again has the balls to go, "Oh, I didn't hear anything, but, sorry if I pissed in your cornflakes." And it's 4 days until he shows up again. Wow. That's well done, Cyrene. You managed to make a legionnaire so uncomfortable, it took him 4 days before he dared show his face again, lest you assault him with more words. Funny. Though to be fair, it may not be only the theological problem that's weighing Argyle down so much. A hint later, we hear about him decapitating a training servitor because he's a wee bit frustrated, and the reason for that being that Lorgar hasn't shown himself for 2 weeks. They've just been sitting there, waiting to invade this world for 2 weeks. And from what we know about the Astartes, they tend to be somewhat impatient when there's violence and murder to be had, so perhaps it is less the purely theological problems that worries him so, although his reaction to Cyrene would certainly suggest otherwise, and maybe it is just simple impatience. It is possible, albeit, circumstances being what they are. Contributing factor, sure. Decisive? Probably not. And on the subject of anger towards the Emperor, we have another interesting conversation between Argyle and Torgal. Torgal is not afraid to state that he is angry, and that he feels the Legion has been wronged, and that they have been walking the wrong path. Which is an interesting thing to say, because on the one hand, it states that the Emperor was in the wrong for treating them in the way he was, but it also states that they were walking the wrong path, which seems to vindicate the Emperor's actions in chastising them. Now, of course, anger doesn't have to be logical. It doesn't have to be a well-thought-through emotion. It could simply just be anger. And they might not even have an entirely decent idea of why they're angry, but this seems a particularly strange thing. Again, they've been sitting here for 2 weeks, and they haven't thought this through any further than we have been wronged, and yet we have also been wrong. It seems like being angry at a parent for chastising you for stealing cookies. But even though you may be angry to begin with, by the simple fact that you were being yelled at, would that emotion not usually translate into shame of some sort? Of being caught, or of having done something that you apparently know to be wrong? Now, I may be extrapolating a little bit too much here, but it sounds to me as if the word-bearers, they might pay lip service to the idea that, the Emperor told us we were wrong, so since he's God, I guess we'll have to listen to him. But it also seems that they don't really accept the fact that they have been wrong, and that they definitely still view the Emperor for being in the wrong for chastising them. Which once again returns us to the question of how fanatical were they really, because honestly, they sound as if they gave up on the Emperor remarkably easily. Especially when you take into consideration that this is far from the first time that their somewhat barking mad ideas have been criticized. Never this strongly, true, but this should not have come as a shock to them. What I'm trying to say is, I am questioning whether or not they truly believed in the Emperor as a god, or whether or not they truly believed in Lorgar's word that he was a god. A subtle but very important distinction. But let's return to Cyrene for a bit, because she's way more fun, as she will soon prove. She receives a strange visitor who asks why she's named her servitor. She's named him Caleb because he was a merchant, a meat merchant, who was lynched and then turned into a servitor for selling the wrong kind of meat. Once again, the definition of monarchy as the perfect city seems a tad overblown, possibly. Well, I mentioned in a recent lore video on Servitors that you're only really made into a servitor if you do something really, really horrible, but the definition of what is really, really horrible, it can vary. Selling dog's meat instead of lamb, apparently, is worthy of eternal servitude as a brain-wiped husk. Yeah, sure, why not? Seems reasonable to me. But back to Cyrene. Once again, we get a conversation with her and her mysterious guest, who turns out to be Zaphon. And the word-bearer's chaplain falls prey to Sirene's sharp tongue. They get into a little bit of a discussion about faith, unworthy idols and so on, and Sirene says that there are no gods but the Emperor, and therefore the worship of false idols, once you know about the Emperor, would be impossible. Something Zaphon, of course, thinks is less true than he may have a few months ago. And he gives her the whole spiel about worshipping in error because they thought that the divine should be worshipped merely because it is divine, which of course confuses Sirene because she's not privy to the word-bearer's redefining of terms, their new ideas. The Emperor was a god because the Emperor had power, but now that the Emperor has rejected the word-bearers, instead of holding true to their faith, they will now try and seek out a deity that is willing to be worshipped in the way they wish to worship it. Sirene is still subscribing to the old idea that a god deserves worship because it is a god, whilst the word-bearers, as we've talked about previously, has now decided that a god is only a god worthy of worship if that god is willing to behave in a godly manner, I suppose. And I find it extremely telling how Sirene, as a religious person, raised religious, and having lived in a religious society all her life to the point that she doesn't bat an eyelash at somebody being turned into a servitor for selling the wrong kind of meat, even she cannot understand the leaps of logic the word-bearers are making here, which just goes to show how much the word-bearers are changing their own tune, how much they are redefining their faith to fit their own current narrative. The idea of having faith, and having that faith be justified, is completely supreme in their minds, to the point that the leaps of logic they are now making, the ideas they're now coming up with, which they still seem to think is based on their own ideas, are completely foreign to this person who has been raised entirely on their religious dogma. And I would also like to stress how quickly this has happened. This has taken months at most, and they have completely changed their tune. Their entire worldview has been so drastically flipped and altered and redefined to the point of being unrecognizable for one of their own disciples, and it has come entirely naturally to them. There has been no rift inside of the Word-Bearers Legion, no schism, no divide between those who still believe in the Emperor and those who don't. The entire Legion has acted in perfect unison as an apparent hive mind. It's incredible, and seems to be yet further evidence to suggest that what the Word-Bearers were actually worshipping were Lorgar's words, and Lorgar's ideas about faith, rather than the Emperor. And speaking of this apparent divide between the two, between their faith in the Emperor and the faith in Lorgar, Lorgar is now moving to ensure that that divide widens yet further. He wishes to ensure that he and his word is of paramount importance to his word-bearers, which makes sense considering what he is about to propose. And so, when the word-bearer's entire force arrives in orbit above a planet known as 4716 by Imperial designation, he has a rather special order. Word-bearers, kill every last man, woman, and child on that heretical world. Quite the dramatic departure from the old love, peace, and kindness idea that Lorgar were talking about just a bit earlier. In fact, in the previous chapter, one of Lorgar's strengths that he could never commit acts of cruelty with a smile like his brothers can. Well, smile or no smile, he clearly was more than willing to commit acts of cruelty when it benefited him. And make no mistake, this is a cold, calculated move on behalf of Lorgar, one aimed at cementing his position within the Legion and against the Imperium, the Emperor in particular. For the reason he gives for his sudden change in demeanor is that the Imperium and the Emperor demands it. He himself does not believe that the people of 4716 are beyond redemption, but because the Emperor has demanded that the word-bearers pick up the pace of their conquest, the world must die, for it is the swiftest way to render it compliant. And this, of course, paints the Imperium, and the Emperor in particular, as the bad guys. Why are the word-bearers and our kind, gentle Primarch being forced to commit such atrocities, such genocides, simply because the Imperium is impatient? That's horrible, and it would be, if it was correct, but it is most definitively an exaggeration on Lorgar's behalf to state that the Imperium demands that they make their conquests quite so quick. The Imperium has no real problem with genociding entire populations, don't get me wrong. If it is necessary, they will happily wipe out hundreds of millions of civilians and not bat so much of an eyelash at it. But it is a measure of last resort, which is reflected in the fact that the power and authority to call down exterminatus and the genocide of entire world's population lies solely in the hands of the Imperium's highest level of military officials, the Emperor, the Primarchs, and sector commanders. It is not a decision that the Imperium takes lightly. And even amongst the more unruly legions, like the Space Wolves, it is thoroughly understood that this is a power to be used exceptionally sparingly. We have examples of the Space Wolves launching massive long-term wars of conquest against planetary empires who have rejected all overtures of unity and even, quite literally, spat in the Space Wolves' face. And you can imagine how tolerant the Space Wolves are of that sort of behavior. And yet even then, they restrained themselves enough to conquer the worlds rather than simply exterminate them. So Lorgar's claim that he is being de facto forced into doing this rings quite hollow indeed. Especially as he also says, kill every man, woman, and child on that heretical world, claiming to abide by imperial decree in the one moment, and yet clearly flaunting the biggest and most important of instructions in the very next. That's to not be using terms like heretics and gods and so on. Even Argyle later, when speaking to Sereni to justify the actions, use very religious language to explain why they did what they did. And he also reveals that the Legion was clearly lied to in more than just one way about the reason for why they were invading the world. The Legion was also told that the word-bearers had made peaceful overtures to the people of 4716, and that they had all been universally rejected, and that the people of 4716 were irreversibly corrupted. Argyle even brings up the point that they deployed artificials against the Legionnaires, which they most certainly did, and that is not something that the Imperium is overly fond of. But Argyle and the rest of the Legion, of course, had no way of knowing that before they actually attacked the final bastion. It comes as a very clear shock and surprise to the word-bearers when they run into the artificials. So clearly, that was not part of the judgment of whether or not they were to attack the world. Of course, the real reason will be revealed a little bit later on in the book, but this is just to further illustrate that Lorgar had absolutely no problems whatsoever with manipulating his legion. Oh, and back to Cyrene for a little bit. Cyrene is a rather interesting character because she provides a lot of insight into the characters in the book. But occasionally she also turns into a very clear plot device, and this is one of those moments. She's asking Argyltal why they eradicated the planet's population, why they felt justified in doing so. Argyltal gives her a spiel about the Imperium is right because it is mighty, which, you know, it's a somewhat basic philosophy, but it's not necessarily incorrect. I mean, to give you a nice and simple example, if the Nazis won the Second World War, do you think our history books would state that they were wrong in waging that war? History is, as they say, written by the victors, and so the age-old saying might makes right is not necessarily incorrect, it's just not a very moral position. But think about this. This is a question raised by Serene, a woman that has been entirely indoctrinated into the word from her, well, first moments, really. She has been made into a religious fanatic, a person that fully and entirely believes that there is a God, and that God is alive and is real, that it is demonstrable that God is real, and that he has chosen humanity above all others, and yet here she is, questioning the righteousness of that very same Imperium. Huh. Okay. That's quite the interesting position. And then she also says something which makes me question it even further. Argyltal says, look, we are conquering the galaxy. That has to show our manifest destiny, our indisputable superiority. We are winning out against all others, and surely that means that we are the rightful rulers of the galaxy, because we're winning. Now again, that is fairly simplistic logic by our standards, but to a person who has been literally raised on the idea that the Imperium is not just correct, but sacred, like Serene, this line of logic should make perfect sense, and yet, not only does she question it, she states other races have done so before in regards to conquering the galaxy. How the fuck does Serene know that? Again, first and foremost, the fact that the Eldar once held sway over the galaxy is not exactly common everyday knowledge in the Imperium, and on a backwater world in a city like Monarchia, who didn't even apparently know that there are other legions out there, for Serene, a religious official at that apparently, to know about this? And again, I'd like to stress, the fact that the Eldar once held sway over the galaxy, that's not something that the Imperium wants its populace to know, because that kinda, calls into doubt the whole perfection of humanity thing, doesn't it? If we only now are trying to emulate the previous achievements of the vile Xenos species. The Xeno species that are still around, mind you. And it certainly would quite drastically go against the Imperium's official line that all Xeno species are not only inferior to humanity, but a straight-up, non-negotiable threat to humanity. And yet apparently, on backwater worlds with a primarily religious way of educating people, they teach them about the Eldar and their empire in school. Sure. Right. See, this is why you have to be so careful when you're writing a character that is supposed to be perceptive, because it can be really beneficial to have such a character, because on repeated occasions throughout the book, she delivers some really interesting insight into the word bearers. But when you have a character whose purpose is basically to provide fourth wall breaking insight to the reader, you need to tread a very careful line, and taking into consideration what the character might actually know so as to not raise questions. Another very blatant example is when Argyltal talks about the artificials in the city and how they deployed combat servitors to fight against the artificials. And Serene, who knows what a servitor is because, well, she even named Kale and talks about how the production of servitors were given to the people of Monarchia by Lorgar, so again, she knows precisely what a servitor is, she knows how it functions, and she knows how it isn't a robot. Or actually, scratch that, I don't think she even has a concept of what a robot is, other than a servitor. It would be like going to a robotics person who has no knowledge of 40k and going, you know what we could do? We could just turn a human into an automaton. He wouldn't have the faintest fucking clue what you're talking about, or even where to begin to analyze that idea. And yet, Cyrene, when she's told about the combat servitors, her reaction is, you deployed artificials of your own? What? How does she even... How does she even make that leap of logic? She probably has no concept of a robot. Again, backwater world with primarily religious teaching. If she has been given any instructions on what a robot is, it would undoubtedly be that robots are evil and heretical and vile, etc. And yet she knows perfectly well what a servitor is, and she assumes that the Adeptus Mechanicus uses robots and not servitors. And to hammer this retarded point even further, when Argyltal explains the difference, she doesn't understand it. Really, Cyrene, you know what a servitor is, but you don't actually know what a servitor is, and why it's different from a robot. Even though you know that servitors are made from people. Literally. You told us of an example in which a human was turned into a servitor as punishment. Ugh. Again, I do love Cyrene, because she provides some real insight, but... as mentioned, if you're gonna have a character whose primary role is to provide plot point insight, then you do still need to have a long, hard look. In fact, in that case, you specifically need to have a longer and harder look at that character's dialogue and ask yourself, would she know this? Would she think like this? Or does this come across as nothing more than author self-insertion? And speaking of self-insertion, here's an advertisement attempting to sell you coconut oil. Or something. I don't actually know what it's going to try and sell you, but I'm pretty sure it's going to try and sell you something. And now that that unpleasantness is over, let's get back to it. There are a couple more things that is worthy of mentioning in this chapter. The first being the Chaplains, who have painted their armor black, in remembrance of Monarchia and the ashes after the fall of the Perfect City. Which is interesting, both because it's aha, that's where the whole painting armor blacks come from, but also a bit of a, So, the other Space Marine legions are still doing something started by the Wordbearers, despite knowing that the Wordbearers turned to chaos. Right. This is one of those things that sounds really cool, like, oh yeah, that's totally what happened at the first time you hear it, and then the next time you start wondering, would the other legions really do that? Especially some of them. Would the Ultramarines really look at the Wordbearers and go, yeah, I know they turned crazy and started worshipping the ruinous powers, but it is a snazzy color scheme. Oh well, I suppose. Though, to be fair, the Chaplains were not originally intended to fill a purely religious role. They were more safekeepers of the Legion's lore and tradition, really, to begin with, so I guess you could argue that the Primarchs and the Legions decided that there was enough of a difference between the two to, you know, keep them in the exact same form? Who knows? And the second point of interest is the Adeptus Mechanicus and their combat servitors of the 9th Maniple. One of their servitors, a Conqueror pattern, has been carved with Colchissian runes in recognition of its service. This is obviously meant as a way to honour the machine and to bring it into the Brotherhood. The Wordbearers themselves treat it with a great deal of respect as if it was an honoured comrade rather than, you know, a brainless robot. Which in and of itself is interesting. That's a bit of an unusual thing for Legionnaires to do. But what is even more interesting is what we will learn about the servitor a bit further on in the book. It behaves very, very oddly, and I think this can be added in as yet another piece of evidence that Colchis' ancient traditions, its religions, its, well, runic writing system, all of it, is so thoroughly steeped in chaos as to be utterly inseparable from it. I'm really curious as to how cultures must have looked before Lorgar wiped out the old religion, because with how strongly it seems to have been connected to chaos, it must have looked like a living hell, right? Covered in sacrificial altars and orgy pits and all manners of nasty. Huh. I'm starting to wonder how the fuck the Emperor could have overlooked all of this. Again, he arrived at the point where Lorgar had already wiped out the old religion, and that undoubtedly endeared him a great deal to the Emperor, but the sheer amount of chaos nonsense that must have been present on this planet. Good God, you'd think there'd be some, scarring behind, I'd guess. And speaking of strange things, there really are a lot in this book. The Custodies. When Argyltal sees the Custodies, he points out that there is something wrong with how they fight. And after observing them for a while, he comes to the conclusion that the Custodies are warriors, not soldiers. That they fight individually brilliantly, but they lack the tactics of a group, of a squad, of a pack, as he puts it. And this does make a degree of sense, since the Custodies are urged to act in a far more independent manner than the Legionis Astartes. They are far fewer in number and required to do far more things. They are not merely warriors, they are spies, intelligence personnel, decoders, infiltrators, warriors, assassins, etc. They do whatever the Emperor wants them to do, and they practice these things non-stop, in the blood game, as they call it, where they try to find some way of getting close enough to the Emperor to try and assassinate him, to constantly test out their security grid around the Emperor of Mankind. But this is viewed as a big deal by Argyltal, like a serious weakness. They lack the brotherhood, and therefore he apparently loses the respect for them, as another wordbearer points out. I think this weakness is probably somewhat overblown, as it's not like the Custodies are utterly incapable of doing squad tactics. It's just that they fight... See, it's one of those things where the author basically kind of states the thing and doesn't really explain why that thing makes a difference. Okay, so they're fighting in a group, but they are fighting individually within a group. How does that work? I guess that they don't cover each other, like instinctively. They don't know what the other one is doing, or is moving in a synchronized fashion, I suppose, but then again, in a maddened melee with firearms involved, you probably don't want to be marching in formation either, so it seems like a bit of an odd thing. I get what the author is trying to say here, I just don't think it's quite the big deal that Argyltal is making it out to be. Though, another possible interpretation might be that Argyltal is specifically and purposefully looking for any and all flaws that he possibly can, because he has mentally already started distancing himself from the Imperium. As exemplified by the fact that, as the Custodies use the battle cry for the Emperor, he says that it feels somewhat alien to him, and he also purposefully avoids using the sign of the Aquila to salute the Custodies. So it certainly is possible that this is more to do with Argyltal's psychology at the time than necessarily this being such a large flaw on behalf of the Custodies. It could also be just a kind of a lack of description on precisely what the flaw is, I suppose. Another little odd thing that keeps popping up. The Servitors are referred to as robots on several occasions. I'm assuming this is just kind of a slip-up, perhaps, on the author's part, or is this another attempt at making us question whether or not a servitor is different than a robot, bringing us back to Cyrene, who was like, what's the difference? Despite the fact that she obviously would know the difference. And yet again, the word robot is being used. It feels out of place. I don't know. Maybe it's actually really commonplace, but I'm reacting to it now because of the way Cyrene said it. I'd actually have to do a little bit of digging to figure that out precisely, but it just really stuck out to me when they are being called robots over and over again during a particular section of the book. But now we return to Lorgar once again. After the battle of the city has been finished and the enemy has been crushed, with their automatons being cut off from central command and the religious leadership of the city being butchered, which we should probably talk about that first, because I think I've fucked up the books in question here. I thought it was in this book that we joined a Wordbearer's assault captain as he fought his way inside the shield, and inside the capital, or religious capital, of 4716. But apparently, this wasn't it, so sorry. It's been a while since I did a Horus Heresy lore breakdown, sadly, because of the whole Vrax thing, so my mind is a little bit off. But let's actually address that first. So, when this happened, he eventually entered into what appeared to be a vast cathedral, from which the shield protecting the city against the orbital bombardment, and also the encroachment of the Wordbearers, were emitting. He figured, of course, that this was the premier defensive structure, but instead it was a cathedral, a place of worship, inside of which there was a towering statue of the Emperor. And apparently the locals were worshipping the god Emperor in the form of a storm god, but it was, unmistakably, the Emperor. And so, of course, the Wordbearer in question, I wish I'd remember his name, but tried to vox up into orbit to get into contact with Lorgar and tell them that they were doing something horribly wrong. This was a terrible mistake. They were attacking these people for false reasons. Clearly, something had gone horribly wrong. The negotiation must have been misunderstood or misinterpreted somehow. Lorgar arrived, along with his Terminator elites, and after a brief talk with the Wordbearer, ordered every single person inside of the cathedral to be gunned down in cold blood by his Terminators. Once again, the whole "Lorgar, you could never commit acts of cruelty with a smile." Yeah. Yeah, clearly. Oh, and by the way, apparently, the planet got a copy of Lorgar's book, the Lectitio Divinitatis. I'm pronouncing that wrong every time, and fuck you for pointing it out. But how? How the hell did they manage that? Was this picked up by some rogue trader somewhere, or... I mean, they didn't have an interstellar empire, so it's unlikely they could have traded for it, and even if they did, I mean, this is some specialist fucking literature, and then they would also have had enough time to convert the entire population to this faith. What? There's no indication that the Wordbearers knew of this planet before, unless they came here on purpose and then they knew about it, but that's not explained, so... Did one of the Wordbearers arrive here and convert the planet and then decide, you know, I'm just going to sit on this for a while, and by the way, I'm going to turn the Emperor into a storm god because that'll be really convenient in a book further down the line? What? This is a very classic case of plot convenience, I do believe, but hey, details, I suppose. And it certainly does make a pretty large degree of sense for why Lorgar suddenly got so mass murdery. This was a planet that represented what he had wanted for the Imperium, and he wished to cleanse that from the galaxy, both as an action of literal cleansing for himself, a way to distance himself from his previous belief, and to burn his old work, the Lectitio Divinitatis, so that he could truly begin the work of rebuilding the Legion in a new image, with the Book of Lorgar taking the front seat rather than the Divinitatis. Which, of course, once again raises the question of how the Wordbearers knew to come to this particular planet, but, well, again, details. And this is also, too, then, the very first consciously illoyal act that Lorgar commits. because he is fully aware that this is not a disloyal planet. He is fully aware that the planet was not, in fact, resisting. They were overjoyed when they heard that there was an Imperium of Man out there, and they wished to rejoin it as quickly as possible. There is, there's potentially an argument, would they accept the Imperial truth, but I don't know. The Wordbed has certainly never tried to go like, would you like to do this instead? No. They went back up to orbit and went, well, this is clearly a heretical world, which, technically speaking, was not entirely incorrect. But that does not by any stretch of the imagination mean that Lorgar was justified in burning the whole bloody planet. Because, of course, Kur, the planet which Monarchia was a part of, was not burned to the ground by the Emperor. He did not butcher the entire population because of their heresy. He destroyed a city. Now, yes, he killed a bunch of civilians because, for some fucking reason, he had the dumbest possible way to evacuate said city. But, well, apples, oranges, and horses' assholes. Moving right along. In another interesting move, Lorgar decides to teleport down to the planet and meet his wordbearers after the planet has been suitably coerced into compliance by, killing everybody. And he is wearing a odd ensemble. He's wearing the robes of a Colchizian priest. Interesting choice, especially as the Custodies are of course also bearing witness to this. This has got to be a somewhat disturbing thing for them to see, no? They've been ordered to follow the Legion specifically to look out for any further deviant behavior on Lorgar's behalf, particularly of the religious sort, and here he is standing in a priest's robes. One would think that Aquilon, the leader of the Custodies, would be heading right back up into orbit to get on the Voxhorn, or in this case, whispering gently into the skull of an astropath, I suppose. Psst, hey, daddy. Yeah, he doesn't seem to be over that whole priest thing. Yeah, no. Sackcloth robes and everything. Even had makeup on. Yeah, eyeliner. Can you fucking believe it? And then Lorgar goes on to inform the Custodies that even if they were on fire, he would not deign to piss upon them. That they are going to fuck off right now, or he would have them all shot. And even goes so far as to order Corferon to have the wordbearers level their bolters at the Custodies. Then he plunks down a teleportation homer in front of them, and essentially tells them to shove it up their golden assholes and swivel. And the Custodies do it. Why? This probably is the single most dumbass point in the book. I swear to God. The Custodies have been ordered by the Emperor himself to ensure that Lorgar is on the correct path. And now suddenly Lorgar is like, no. We need privacy. Oh, and also fuck you. And they just leave? Really? Really? Again, these guys are trained not only as warriors, but as diplomats, spies, infiltrators, etc. And not only do they just leave, they got nothing. No listening devices, no cameras, no operatives, no infiltrators, no nothing. They just leave and let the Primarch and the Legion they have been given strict orders to keep an eye on communicate in private with them all gathered in roughly the same area without any supervision. Alright. Again, maybe Argyle is right. Maybe the Custodies aren't all that, because they sure look pretty fucking stupid as far as I'm concerned. And of course, Lorgar uses this very opportunity to go, yeah, we're gonna go on a religious pilgrimage now, dudes. Fuck me gently, Mr. Satan. This is some dumb shit. And yeah, Lorgar's threatening them, sure, but do you think that's foremost in the Custodies' mind in this moment? Oh hey, Lorgar's basically threatening to shoot us, the Emperor's proxies and watchdogs in this regard, but yeah, that's fine. Nothing overly suspicious about that. I guess we'll just back off and give the word bearers, who are still under the most extreme suspicion and scrutiny, a little bit of alone time. What could possibly go wrong? The Custodies have literally no reason whatsoever to give in to these threats, unless you assume that the Custodies think that their lives are worth more than the mission. That they are putting their own lives above the orders they have been given by the Emperor. Which, if we know anything at all about the Custodies, is not the case. At all. Indeed, they will demonstrate this fact later on in the book, but no. Now they want to give up. Hell, even if they were giving up because they hadn't put in place any, dead man switch or something to make sure that the Imperium got the message, even if that was the case, the simple fact that the Custodies assigned to the wordbearers suddenly go, poof, gone, that'd probably be enough of a hint. This is pure plot convenience, and it's not even plot convenience for the sake of moving the plot forward. Lorgar could still have informed the various commanders of his legion through secretive means, agents moving around the fleet, secret Vox broadcasts, stuff like that. But instead, this is done solely for dramatic reasons, with Lorgar up on a podium speaking to his whole legion in public, out and out, in the open, outright denouncing the Emperor's censor of them, and saying that they're now going to go on a religious pilgrimage to see if they can't find some other gods. And Lorgar must have been supremely confident in that none of his legion would go against him. Otherwise, he just outed his entire plan to somebody that might possibly betray him. Again, I think I've pretty much come to the conclusion now that the wordbearers never worshipped the Emperor at all. The only thing they ever worshipped was Lorgar's word. And on that note, I'll wrap up part 3, and this will almost certainly be taking the record. I mean, the Thousand Sun lore breakdown was only, 4 parts? Well, we're heading into part 4 now, and we're still only on chapter 9, so buckle in. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.